the book of Exodus what God's Spirit is saying. Hear what God's Spirit is saying to you. But Moses said to the Lord, "O my Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor even now that you have spoken to your servant. But I am slow of speech and slow of tongue." Then the Lord said to him, "Who gives speech to the mortals? Who makes them mute or deaf, seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you are to speak." But he said, "O my Lord, please send someone else." Then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, "What of your brother Aaron the Levite? I know that he can speak fluently. Even now he is coming out to meet you. But when he when he sees you, his heart will be glad. You shall speak to him and put words in your mouth, and I will be with your mouth and with his mouth, and teach you what you shall do. He indeed shall speak for you to the people, and he shall serve as a mouth for you, and you shall serve as God for him. Take in your hand this staff, which with all shall perform the signs." Moses went back to his father-in-law Jethro and said to him, "Please let me go back to my kindred in Egypt and see whether they are still living." And Jethro said to Moses, "Go in peace." Here ends the reading of words that give us insight on God. May God grant us with wisdom and courage for interpretation.
Comic-Con Sunday, as I said, is my favorite Sunday of the year, just about. I love that our church celebrates Comic-Con and all things Comic-Con and superhero and anime and all sorts of stuff. When I was single, I actually used to volunteer at Comic-Con just so I could get into the exhibit hall for free and walk around. And now that Carlos and I have kids, we make it a point to dress up and go down to Comic-Con every year. And in fact, we chose Amani as godfather. A very big reason is because he has never missed a Comic-Con since he was 14 years old. He is a Comic-Con geek, and we wanted somebody to impart that wisdom on our daughter. So actually, there were so many reasons why we chose that godfather, but that was a big reason as well. As you can tell, our family does love Comic-Con. I love Comic-Con, and one of my favorite aspects of Comic-Con is the Marvel universe. I love the Marvel comic books and the Marvel movies, and that's what I'm going to focus on today. But before we get into that, I would like all of us to take a moment to pray. So pray with me, please. Holy God, we thank you for University Christian Church, for the celebrations, for the love, and for everything that happens when we come together. We thank you for our children, for the joy and the light that they bring to this congregation. And I ask that you'll be with us in these next few minutes as we explore what it means to be a hero in your universe. And now may the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, God, our rock and redeemer. Amen. So really quickly, I just want to know who I'm working with here. How many of you have actually read a comic book in your lifetime? It could be anything, Little Lulu, Batman, whatever. All right. And then how many of you have actually watched a TV show or a movie based on a comic book? It could be Archie in Riverdale. It could be Gotham City. It could be, all right. So most of you, if not all of you, like I said, Marvel is my favorite comic book series and my favorite comic book company. There are thousands of comic book companies, very tiny ones, Marvel being the biggest these days. And it's the most epic and recognizable, and that's in large part based on their wonderful writers and their wonderful editors, people like Jack Kirby, Donny Cates, even Ta-Nehisi Coates, who many people know, G. Willow Wilson, Kelly Sue DeConnick, and of course the ever-popular Stan Lee, who is a pop icon actually all around the world, not just in the United States. I could go on and on and on for days about everything that the Marvel Corporation and its employees have achieved. This company has overcome some major obstacles, including a government trial that claimed that comic books were perverting America's youth in 1954. And really sadly, the majority of comic book companies didn't survive that assault and ended up closing their doors for good. In fact, Marvel barely survived. After that, a couple decades later, they also survived a horrible bankruptcy where they had to let go of about 90% of their staff. So what they've achieved in the last 13 years with the Marvel Cinematic Universe and the push for more diversity in their comic books has really been beyond everyone's expectations. But the true beauty in the Marvel comic books and the movies is in its writers and its editors and the characters and the universes that they so finely create. They create some of these characters and storylines even when they know that it might displease their readers. They create them knowing that it's the right thing to do. So for example, they created some of the first Black superheroes ever seen in mainstream comics. We know one of them, Black Panther. He first appeared in 1969, as well as Luke Cage, who was actually the very first Black hero protagonist featured in his very own comic book in 1972. All of that during the height of the Civil Rights Movement. Both characters have also had recent successes in the Marvel Cinematic Universe with their own TV show and a movie. Marvel also created the first Muslim American superhero, who happens to be a teenager, in Kamala Khan, and she is Ms. Marvel. That was in 2013. And this September, Marvel is also premiering Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. He's the first Asian superhero to be featured in Marvel movies with a primarily Asian American cast. These are all really significant as it gives visibility and representation to people who don't usually get to be the protagonists. And unlike many comic book heroes, many of Marvel's heroes have also been openly gay. The first hero being North Star, a member of the X-Men. And the creator of North Star intentionally made him gay in 1979. However, the Comic Code Authority, which were the big bosses that were basically comic book censors for a long time, wouldn't allow particular storylines. So what Marvel had to do was just hint at the fact that he might be gay. And when Marvel decided collectively to drop the Comic Code Authority because they were sick of having to censor themselves, they formally announced that North Star was gay in 1992, and he married his partner in a comic book storyline in 2012. There are many more LGBTQ+ characters, including Valkyrie, who you may have seen in some of the Avengers and Thor movies. He's one of Thor's greatest allies. And one of my favorite X-Men, Wolverine, has a storyline in which he's actually bisexual in an alternate universe. All of this to say that Marvel has always been on the cusp of what is right and has tried to be a voice of reason, love, and acceptance for everyone. And it was under Stan Lee's writing and as an editor that Marvel started focusing more and more on superhero storylines. And these storylines, before that, actually, a lot of their comics weren't superheroes. But these storylines clearly addressed the same issues that were happening in the world around them. And to this day, they bring those issues into their comic books. Stan Lee and Marvel had made it a point to stand up for justice, to address bigotry and hatred, and to create a universe and superheroes that are constantly fighting for justice, for what's right, and for a world that's accepting of everyone. These characters are mind-blowing. If you've watched the movies, if you've seen the comic books, with their zaps and their kapows and their axes and arrows and their little balls of fire that they throw around. And when we think of superheroes, I think that we're attracted to all these things, the power and the strength that they possess, and oftentimes their seemingly immortality. They do these things that we really can't do as human beings. But again, I go back to the fact that the beauty in the Marvel Universe is in the writing. Because when we really dig deep into these superhero characters, they're actually not much different than you or me. So maybe I really can't wield an axe like Thor, and maybe you can't throw down like Black Widow. But at their core, these superheroes really do look a lot like us, and that is intentional from the writers, because they want us to feel something in common with them. So when Stan Lee began developing many of his superhero characters, he did so in a way that created everyday people into superheroes, like a teenager named Peter Parker, one of the most popular superheroes, who gets bitten by a radioactive spider and becomes Spider-Man. He's one of the most beloved superheroes who fights crime on the streets of New York and happens to be the youngest Avenger, working alongside his own hero, Iron Man. But when Spider-Man takes off his costume, he's still just a teenager who lives with his aunt, who goes to high school, takes tests, goes on field trips, and develops crushes on teenage girls. And Steve Rogers, hello, is a skinny 90-something pound asthmatic who wants nothing more than to fight for justice in his country. So when the US enters World War II, he tries repeatedly to enlist in the army and only gets laughed at and rejected because he is so skinny and scrawny and he has asthma and the army doesn't want him. So he can't enlist, and he ends up volunteering for Project Rebirth, where he receives a super soldier serum that enhances his physical abilities to superhuman levels. And there we have Captain America. Or let's look at Tony Stark. He's actually one of my favorite characters because of his complexities. Tony Stark is the CEO of the largest tech conglomerate in the world, in the Marvel Universe. He's a genius inventor with a ton of money. His company creates all kinds of technology that makes life beautiful and fancy and easy, and they also happen to be a major weapons manufacturer. Tony's a billionaire, to say the least, and he's a womanizer who loves to party. And I mean, he really doesn't have a care in the world, or so it seems. Except that one day, he has a near-death experience and is kidnapped by a group of terrorists. Events unfold, and it's in this lowest moment when he feels he's lost everything and is on the brink of death that he begins to see just how destructive the weapons his company makes truly are. Being a genius inventor while he's kidnapped, he creates a suit of armor and escapes his captors. He manages to make it back to the United States and creates different versions of his suit until it's just right. And then he quickly declares that he has more to offer this world than making things blow up. He shuts down the weapons division of his company, takes the new suit of armor and uses it to fight for good and for justice, and becomes Iron Man, a superhero that eventually becomes a founding member of the Avengers. And while yes, these superheroes all have immense strength and skill, they're actually really flawed, dynamic, and have weaknesses of their own. Spider-Man is shy. He's never part of the cool kids at school, even though he's a superhero. He doesn't tell anyone, and he often walks around the halls of his school feeling really insecure. He's just a kid. Captain America, even though he's big and strong now, and he spends years of his life as a superhero, he always craves the one thing he cannot have in his modern life, and that's a normal life and love with Peggy Carter, his true love. And behind Iron Man's armor lies a former womanizer who constantly mourns the death of his father and who suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder after the Battle of New York, which you can watch in the first Avengers movie. So in fact, the Avengers themselves, this big group of superheroes, actually fight all the time. They're always fighting and bickering so much that sometimes it gets in the way of their success. And at one point, it even leads to a civil war and two factions of the Avengers. These storylines, y'all, if you actually follow them, they're really complex. And actually, they're not unlike many of the stories that we see and read in the Bible. So you might think I'm exaggerating a little bit, but let's be honest, especially those of you who grew up in church and Sunday school, we've been taught to view biblical characters as superhuman, right? As superheroes. David defeats a giant with just a stone and a slingshot. Or if we even look closer at Jesus' disciples, Peter, who is oftentimes hailed as the leader of the disciples, a man that displays so much depth of faith in his confession of Christ as the Son of God, is the same Peter that denies Jesus 3 times as they're about to condemn him to death. So if we look at the verses that Ariana read so beautifully right now, we see Moses, one of our greatest biblical heroes ever. When God is asking Moses to take leadership, Moses reminds God, as if God doesn't know or doesn't remember, that he has a speech impediment. God, I'm slow of speech and slow of tongue. He tells God that he really just can't lead. He's weak. He's not a leader. And in fact, after agreeing to take leadership, even after that whole conversation, he says, okay, I'll go, try. Moses continues to feel like he's not a leader. He continues to question himself because Pharaoh won't budge when he keeps asking him to let his people go. So Moses spends so much of his time questioning God and questioning himself and God's choice in choosing him. But we all know how that story ends, right? Moses, this man who questions himself with a speech impediment, eventually leads the Israelites out of slavery, out of Egypt, parting the Red Sea away from Pharaoh to the edge of the promised land. God uses Moses even with all his flaws, even with all his questioning. We love these stories, be it in comics, be it in old tales, like the one Caleb was talking about, or be it in the Bible. Because these are the human stories. Aren't these the stories that attract and compel us because they remind us of ourselves, of what we are capable or what we might be capable of? We are all flawed. We have weaknesses, and we question ourselves constantly. Maybe it's not a speech impediment like Moses, or maybe it is. Or maybe you have a physical trait like Steve Rogers or King David that gets in the way of your belief in yourself. Or maybe it's an addiction like Tony Stark and his womanizing. Or maybe a mental health disorder like Tony Stark's PTSD, or Wanda Maximoff's depression. But whatever our weaknesses are, they are never so weak that God cannot use us. And in fact, it's sometimes in our weakest moments that we have our deepest revelations of God. And we see that in Jesus, our greatest superhero, who came down not as a mighty warrior or a powerful king on a throne, but as a humble baby born into a working class family, a rebel rouser, somebody who grew up ruffling feathers and challenging the status quo and challenging the empire, whose theology was to love. Love God, love your neighbor, love everyone around you, especially the marginalized. Jesus, the leader who was crucified for his message and through some great mystery was made alive again by God, and whose message continues today through us every time that we gather together as we are now. Every time that we actively choose to love, choose to serve, and choose to accept those around you. So believe it or not, you are no different than Moses. You are no different than Tony Stark or Peter Parker or many of the Marvel superheroes or many of our biblical heroes. All we need to do is accept our call and live it out. You don't need to say a special prayer or even get bitten by a radioactive spider to accept this call. Honestly, all you need to do is live it moment by moment, accepting that we are all human and we will mess up, but when we do, that we will get back out there and continue to love and to speak up for what's right and what's true, to stand up for justice, to tear down bigotry and hate, and to be a voice of reason and acceptance. And when we do that over and over and over again, especially when it's not easy, when we do that, that is what makes us superheroes in this universe. And to finish off my sermon, I will let one of my personal superheroes, Stan Lee, have the final word. And this was actually one of his final messages that he sent to fans about a year before he passed away.
Hi, heroes. This is Stan Lee coming at you. Want you to know, Marvel has always been and always will be a reflection of the world right outside our window. That world may change and evolve, but the one thing that will never change is the way we tell our stories of heroism. Those stories have room for everyone, regardless of their race, gender, religion, or color of their skin. The only things we don't have room for are hatred, intolerance, and bigotry. That man next to you, he's your brother. That woman over there, she's your sister. And that kid walking by, hey, who knows? He may have the proportionate strength of a spider. We're all part of one big family, the human family, and we all come together in the body of Marvel. And you're part of that family. You're part of the Marvel universe that moves ever upward and onward to greater glory. In other words, Excelsior!